There is a stadium in Atlanta. 60,000 people are inside it. They came to watch something comfortable, something expected. They came to watch Spain win. Spain, the number 2 team in the world, the reigning champions of Europe, a squad assembled from the greatest clubs on the planet. They had 27 attempts at goal. 27. The ball simply would not go in. And at the final whistle, the man standing in the goal at the other end of the pitch began to cry. He stood there alone, gray at his temples, 40 years old, tears running down his face. The stadium went quiet. Nobody had predicted this moment. Nobody had planned for it. It just happened. On a warm Monday evening in June, in a city that had no idea it was about to witness one of the greatest shocks in the history of football. You are listening to Undersung. This is the story of the people the world forgot to watch. Tonight, that story belongs to a tiny nation. A nation that most people could not find on a map. A nation that had never played a single World Cup match before this summer. A nation of 500,000 people, spread across 9 small islands, sitting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. And in 7 days, they did not lose once. How does something like that happen? That is the only question that matters tonight. Cabo Verde, known in English as Cape Verde, is not a country that appears in football conversations. It is a group of 9 islands, sitting roughly 570 kilometers off the western coast of Africa. Its nearest neighbors are Senegal and Mauritania. Its population is just over 500,000 people. For comparison, there are individual cities in Europe with more people than this entire nation. It was a Portuguese colony for 5 centuries. It became independent in 1975. And for most of the 50 years since then, its national football team existed quietly in the lower sections of African competition, largely unknown to the outside world, until this summer. On the 15th of June, 2026, Cape Verde held Spain to a goalless draw. Spain, with a squad worth more than the entire Cape Verdean economy. 0 goals. 6 days later, Cape Verde faced Uruguay, a nation that won the very first World Cup ever played. Cape Verde came back from 2-1 down at halftime. They drew 2-2. 2 matches, 2 draws, 0 defeats. A nation playing in their first World Cup in history, and they have not lost yet. So before we talk about what happened on the pitch, we need to understand something more important. We need to understand who these people are, where they came from, and why, when the biggest teams in the world came at them, they did not break. For most of its history, Cape Verde football existed in the background, not just of world football, of African football. The national team, nicknamed the Blue Sharks, spent decades competing quietly in qualifying rounds that most of the world never noticed. They never reached the World Cup. Year after year, tournament after tournament, they were simply not there. That began to change slowly. In recent years, they started reaching the Africa Cup of Nations. They started competing. But the World Cup felt like a different conversation entirely. The World Cup was for big nations, wealthy football associations, countries with famous leagues and famous clubs and famous names. Cape Verde had none of those things. And then, on the 13th of October, 2025, Cape Verde beat Eswatini 3-0. That result confirmed what felt impossible. Cape Verde had finished above Cameroon in their qualifying group. Cameroon, a nation that has reached the World Cup 8 times, a nation with genuine football history. Cape Verde finished above them, and for the first time in the history of this small island nation, they were going to the World Cup. Now here is the thing that makes this squad even more remarkable. This team was not built from a domestic league. Cape Verde does not have a famous football league. It does not produce academy players who go to Real Madrid or Manchester City at 15 years old. What it has is a diaspora. Hundreds of thousands of Cape Verdean people live across Europe and beyond, in Portugal, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in the United States. Their children grew up playing football in those countries. Some of them became professionals in those leagues, and the head coach, known simply as Bubista, spent years tracking them down, calling them, convincing them, reminding them that a small island nation deserved their loyalty, even if the world had not noticed it yet. One of those players has a story worth pausing on. His name is Roberto Lopes. Everyone calls him Pico. A few years ago, Pico was working at a bank in Dublin, Ireland. He was a mortgage advisor. He sat at a desk. He processed loan applications. On weekends, he played part-time football for a local club. Not professionally, not in front of big crowds. Just football, because he loved it. One day, a message arrived in his LinkedIn inbox. He almost deleted it. It looked like spam. But it was not spam. It was the Cape Verde national football team, asking whether he would consider representing them. His father had been born on the islands. That made him eligible. He said yes. He left his desk job. He left Dublin. And on the 15th of June, 2026, he started at center-back for Cape Verde against Spain. In the 88th minute of that match, with Spain pressing for a winner, Pico made a last-ditch block that kept the scoreline at 0. From a bank desk in Dublin to a World Cup pitch in Atlanta. That is this squad. But of every story on this team, every journey, every improbable path, every background that no football scout thought to look twice at, one stands apart from all the rest. One man had to wait longer than any of them. One man came closer to never arriving. He did not play outfield. He stood between the posts. His real name is Josimar, but nobody calls him that. On the islands, in the dressing room, in 5 countries across 2 continents, everyone calls him by a single name. Vozinha. He was born in Mindelo. Mindelo is the main city on the island of São Vicente. It is a small city, colorful buildings, ocean on every side, music in the streets. Cape Verde is famous for its music, a sound the locals call morna. Melancholic, beautiful. The sound of people who know something about longing. Vozinha grew up in that city, but he did not grow up with his parents. His father served in the military. His mother worked to keep the family going, and so the boy was raised by his grandparents. Remember that. The grandparents. We will come back to them. As a young boy, Vozinha wanted to be a goalkeeper, but the coaches did not want him. He was too small, they said. Not tall enough, not built for the position. In football, a goalkeeper who is too small is a goalkeeper who does not play. So Vozinha waited. He trained, he worked, he grew. And then, in his early 20s, something shifted. A late growth spurt changed his body. The boy who had been told he was too small became a man who was 6 feet 2 inches tall. The doors that had been closed began to open, but only slightly. He turned professional in his mid-20s. Think about what that means. Most goalkeepers at this World Cup turned professional as teenagers. By 25, they already had years of senior experience, contracts, club histories, names that scouts recognized. Vozinha was starting from almost nothing, a full decade later than his peers. What followed was a career that most people would have abandoned. Angola, Cyprus, Slovakia, Moldova, Portugal, 5 countries, 9 clubs, no famous stadiums, no Champions League nights, no television cameras following him through airport terminals, just a goalkeeper and his gloves, moving from one city to the next, playing for clubs that most football fans have never heard of. He eventually settled in Portugal, playing for a club called Chaves. Chaves play in Portugal's 2nd division, not the top flight, not European football, the 2nd division, in a small city in the north of the country. That is where Vozinha was, at the age of 40, when the phone rang and someone told him he was going to the World Cup. But before we get to that moment, we need to talk about the moment he almost did not get there at all. A few years before this tournament, after a difficult qualifying campaign for the Africa Cup of Nations, Vozinha made a decision. He was going to walk away from the national team. Not from football. From the national team. He had given years of his life to the Blue Sharks. He had earned nearly 90 caps, appearances for his country. And it was starting to feel like the World Cup, the one dream that had stayed with him since childhood, was simply not going to happen. It was too far away. The timeline was too short. He was too old. He decided it was time to stop, and then his teammates got involved. They talked to him. One by one, they told him to stay. They reminded him of what they were all chasing together. Vozinha later described what happened in his own words. He said, "They encouraged me to stay because of the World Cup. I stayed because of that, because it was my dream, the dream of all of us." He stayed. And then Cape Verde qualified. And Vozinha, at 40 years old, was named in the squad. The goalkeeper who had been told he was too small. The professional who started too late. The journeyman who had never played in front of the world. He was going to the World Cup. There is one more thing you need to know before we talk about what happened on the pitch. It is about his mother. When Cape Verde arrived in the United States for the tournament, Vozinha's mother was not there. She had wanted to come. Of course she had. But Cape Verde is on a list maintained by the United States government, a list of countries whose citizens must pay a bond of up to $15,000 simply to apply for a travel visa. $15,000. For a family from a small island in the Atlantic, that amount of money was not possible. So his mother stayed home. And her son walked out onto a pitch in Atlanta, in front of 60,000 people, to play in the biggest match in his country's history, without her in the stands. After the match, in his post-match interview, Vozinha began to cry. He spoke about his grandparents first. He said, "I cried because I grew up with my grandparents. Unfortunately, they were not here. They died a few years before. They were everything for me, everything for my life." Then he spoke about his mother. He said, "She did not manage to be here because of the visa. Because of the money you have to pay for the visa, we did not manage in time. I would like her to be here. But she was there for the next match." After that interview was shared millions of times around the world, people rallied. A United States congressman named Hakeem Jeffries publicly asked the State Department to act. The bond fees were waived. His mother received her visa. She flew to Miami. And when Cape Verde walked out to face Uruguay 6 days later, she was sitting in the stands, watching her son. The one she almost could not afford to see. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a stadium when something impossible is happening. Not the silence of boredom, not the silence of a low-scoring game nobody cares about. The silence of 60,000 people realizing, all at once, that what they are watching was not supposed to be possible. That silence fell over Atlanta on the 15th of June. Spain could not score. Not because they did not try. They tried everything. But there was a 40-year-old man in the Cape Verde goal who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment, in Angola, in Moldova, in Portugal's second division, in stadiums with no cameras, in front of crowds who did not know his name. All of that invisible work arrived on one evening in Atlanta, and it held. When the final whistle blew, Vozinha did not jump. He did not sprint toward his teammates. He stood still, and then he began to cry. Not tears of surprise, not the tears of someone who got lucky. The tears of a man who had waited 40 years for a moment that almost never came. He had almost walked away from the national team just years before. His teammates had talked him back, and now here he was, standing in a World Cup goal, with the noise of Atlanta washing over him, crying for the people who had carried him to this moment. We will not describe what happened on that pitch in detail. You may have already seen it. What matters is this: Cape Verde did not lose. A nation that had never played a single World Cup match before this summer went into their second match against another former champion and came away with another point. Still unbeaten, still standing. Back on the islands, in Mindelo, in Praia, in the small towns and fishing villages across 9 small pieces of land in the Atlantic Ocean, 500,000 people watched, in bars, in living rooms, on phones held up against walls with no signal. They watched their team on the biggest stage in football. And they did not watch them lose. This story is not finished. Cape Verde still have matches to play. The group is not decided. The tournament continues. And somewhere in a dressing room in the United States, a 40-year-old goalkeeper from Portugal's second division is preparing to do it all again. 20 years of invisible work, 2 matches, 2 results that stopped the football world, and a mother, finally, in the stands. The story of Cape Verde is still being written. Right now, there is something in this story that has nothing to do with football. It is about the distance between when a dream begins and when it is finally seen. That distance is usually measured in years, sometimes in decades, and almost all of it happens in the dark. No cameras, no audience, no one to tell you that the work you are doing quietly, in an unremarkable place, on an ordinary Tuesday, is going to matter one day. You just have to keep showing up and trust that it will. Vozinha's grandparents did not live to see Atlanta. His mother almost did not make it to Miami. But the dream did not wait for the right audience to arrive before it kept going. It just kept going, and eventually the world turned around and noticed. Vozinha said it himself, after Atlanta, when the tears had slowed and he was trying to find the words. He said, "I always dreamed that one day Cape Verde should achieve the World Cup. For a small country, the possibility is very, very small." He paused. Then he said, "Today, the dream came true for us." That is Cape Verde. That is Vozinha. That is what the world looks like when it finally notices someone who was always worth noticing. Thank you for being here. Leave a comment and tell me, which part of this story stayed with you? Was it the goalkeeper who nearly walked away before the dream arrived? The mother who almost missed the moment? Or the 9 islands that walked into the biggest room in football and refused to be small?